All right, Groves. Well, welcome to week 2 in our series, Fisherman's Guide to Overcoming Evil. As you know, our whole series is based off this passage that says, instead of being overcome by evil, we need to be the ones overcoming evil. And so as we look at Peter and John's letters, I hope that you are really starting not just to read them in your Grove, but also at home, because I feel like you really need to get into the depth of it. And so today, as we come to what we're going to be reading today, which is 1 Peter chapter 2, I'm going to be honest with you, there's going to be some stuff in there that you're probably not going to like. And it goes back to that whole thing where Jesus in John 6, where the crowds kind of say, hey, this is a hard teaching. And so we're going to have some more hard teaching that may be difficult to swallow. And at first, even the words that are used are kind of like, just don't use that word. I wish you didn't use that word, right? But I think part of the problem is when we read scripture, and this happens to us a lot, is that we kind of read it segmented. We kind of break it apart because that makes it more palpable. So like even in our grows, we'll read chapter 1, and then the next week we'll read chapter 2, but that's not the intent when Peter or John were writing this letter. They weren't meant to be read like, okay, read the first chapter and then take like a week or two, and then read the second chapter and then take a week or two, then read the third chapter. They're meant to be read all together because he's making a case, he's making an argument, he's trying to explain something to us, a bigger picture. And so I feel like sometimes when we break it up, like what we're doing even in the series, you have to be mindful of what we talked about last week, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense what he's saying this week. Sometimes we are very good at taking things out of context, and we'll take like what I just said, we'll find this word that makes us uncomfortable, but if you don't understand the context of what he's saying, then you can misread it. And that's why it's important, even when we do series on Sunday mornings, I get so frustrated because I feel like a lot of times if you miss like part 1 or part 3, you don't get the full thing because it's always building on top of each other. And so as we look at what we're going to be reading today, I want you to remember that Peter is kind of building up to what he's about to say. In fact, the very first word you're going to read when you guys start reading, and today's message here is going to be kind of all over the place because I'm trying to give you kind of a background for what you're going to be talking about and reading so that you kind of have this in your mind as you're discussing these things. But the very first word he says is therefore. And so he's like, therefore is a transition word, which means based on everything I just said, here is what I'm telling you to do. And so he starts off with therefore, because he's saying, based on everything I already covered in chapter 1, which is what we talked about last week, this is what you need to start doing. And so even, as we get into 1 Peter chapter 2, I want you to remember the stuff we talked about last week and how he's talking to these believers, these followers of Jesus who are living in the 60s AD, so 30 plus years after Jesus has been crucified and resurrected and ascended into heaven. And they're scattered throughout the empire. He's talking to, different groups of believers, different churches, if you will. And he's trying to tell them, hey, here's what I want you to know about what it means to follow Jesus, and this is what you need to be doing. And I think you should listen to me as we talked about last week because I have the credentials. I saw all this stuff. I heard it with my own ears. I saw it with my own eyes. I touched it with my own hands. It's like I was an eyewitness. I walked with Jesus. I was with him. I was through all this stuff. And he's saying, here's some stuff I want you to realize. And he starts, if you remember last week, he says, hey, you guys are exiles. He's like, you guys are like outsiders almost, like you're foreigners. It's like you're starting to not fit in with the culture around you because of your faith and your belief in Jesus. And the rest of the world is doing this, and because of Jesus, you're doing this. And so you don't really fit in. It's like you're kind of awkward. And so how are we supposed to live in a world that doesn't quite match up with who you are anymore? And so that's why he kept telling them, hey, don't give in to these evil desires. Don't conform to your old way of life when you lived in ignorance. It's like you got to live as if you're a foreigner, an alien in this world. He says, you have been born again. He uses all this imagery trying to get them to understand their identity in Jesus, which is what we talked about last semester in our grows. And then he starts with therefore. And he's going to talk about, here's what I want you guys to do. I want you to grow up in your salvation. You got to mature. You got to become more than what you currently are. And then he's going to get to, in chapter 2, almost seems like a little bit of a tangent. And he's going to start talking about their identity, but he's going to start talking these terms from the Old Testament. He's going to talk about how, hey, Jesus is the living stone. And he's going to mention 3 different contexts where Jesus talked about being the stone. And a lot of those contexts, he's saying like Jesus is a stumbling block. He's something that people trip over. But he says he's also a stone that it's something that you need to build your life on. You need to build the foundation of what you believe on. And I don't know. It's kind of weird to me. God sometimes does strange things. And this morning, I don't know why, sometimes when I'm doing my own personal quiet times, I just kind of like, I don't recommend this all the time, but at different phases of my life, I'll just be like, okay, God, just open to what you want me to read. And this morning, I actually started reading Isaiah chapter 26, and I got to Isaiah 28, and it gets to this one passage, and he's talking about how the Israelites have kind of turned against God, and he kind of makes this claim against them. He says, and they're saying, "For we have made a lie our refuge and falsehood our hiding place," in chapter 28. He's saying, you guys are just false. It's like you guys don't believe the truth. And then he says this, "So this is what the sovereign Lord says to you. See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. The one who relies on it will never be stricken with panic." And I remember as I was reading this morning, I'm like, wait a minute. That's the passage that Peter is quoting in 1 Peter chapter 2. And I'm like, what are the odds I just open up the Bible and go to the exact passage that 1 Peter 2 quotes? And I was like, oh, that's the context. And I was like, this is what he's talking about. Jesus is the one that the builders, the Jews, rejected. He's like, they keep tripping over Jesus, but he's the foundation. He's the thing that you're building your life upon. And after he says that, he starts quoting all these different things that we are, our identity in Jesus. He's saying, man, you're a chosen people. You're a royal priesthood. You're a holy nation. You're God's special possession. And then he gets to this passage. And I think you have to understand all that before you can understand this passage and then what comes after it, which is what we're going to be talking about today in our groves. He comes to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. He says, "Dear friends," and I got to tell you, that's a lousy translation from the NIV, because really this word here is from the root word agape, which a lot of you guys know is unconditional love. And so this is really like beloved. He's like, your identity is that you are loved and adored by God your Father. You're his possession, all these things he just mentioned. He's like, you're his people. It's like, you're not just friends, like you are way more than friends. He says, "I urge you, as foreigners and exiles," a term he's already used before in chapter 1, you guys don't fit into this world any longer. He says, "to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." And verse 12 is the key. Verse 12 is the key to, I think, unlocking all of 1 Peter, everything he's about to say about how to overcome evil with good. And you kind of have to take everything that we're about to read and filter it through this verse. "Live such good lives among the pagans," amongst the Gentiles. This word just means people that don't believe, okay? "That though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us." He's saying everything I'm about to tell you is based on this passage, on what I am telling you here. He's saying, live such good lives. This kind of goes back to our whole series, and when we ended it with this one, phrase, which was "give blessing," which kind of incorporated all the rest. He's saying, live such good lives, give blessing amongst the non-believers, the pagans, the Gentiles, those that don't have any faith, that don't believe in me, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds, your giving blessing, and glorify God. And then he gets to what he's going to say next. And he says, here's what this looks like. And he's going to talk about authorities. He's going to talk about emperors. And he's going to talk about governors. And he's going to talk about slaves with their masters. And he's going to talk about wives who have unbelieving husbands. And he's going to say, here's how you apply that. He's saying, here's how you live such good lives amongst the non-believers. Here's how you give blessing to those who don't deserve it. And he says many things that may sound difficult, but I think if you understand that context, it'll help you understand what he's saying. He's saying the whole point of all this is that you would live such good lives among the non-believers. You would give such blessing. You would pour out so much hope, so much love, so much kindness, so much goodness, that even though they may accuse you of doing wrong and being, all messed up and screwed up, and they don't agree with what you believe, that they can't help but go, what is it about these people? Why do they give blessing instead of cursing when I'm giving them curses? And it's interesting that Peter is the one writing this, because you have to remember, Peter is in Rome at this point, and he's gonna, in a little bit here, be crucified under Emperor Nero, who was a complete maniac. And yet he's saying here, submit to the authorities. Why? Because you need to live such good lives among the pagans, the non-believers, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and end up glorifying God in the end. He's saying that's the motivation. And he's going to talk about, hey, doing good, bearing up under the pain of unjust suffering. He's going to talk about, hey, even when you do all this stuff, if you suffer for doing what's right, for doing what's good, for giving blessing, he's saying this is a good thing. He says this is commendable before God. And he actually says this word in verse 21. He says, to this you were called. says this is what it means to follow Jesus. This is what it means to be a follower of Jesus, a disciple of Jesus. This is what you were called to. This is what you signed up for. If you're a follower of Jesus, if you're a disciple of Jesus, then this is the kind of treatment you should expect, because you should be giving blessing. You should be doing good, living such good lives amongst the pagans. And so I kind of want you just to get that verse in your head, verse 12, because I feel like it's the key to understanding everything we're going to be talking about today. It's the key to the whole overcoming evil with good. It's like we have got to choose to live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse us of doing wrong, if they don't agree with us, they don't like us, they think we're evil or horrible, that they go, man, but look at all this good stuff they're doing. How do we explain that they're feeding thousands of hungry children? How do we explain that they're bringing women out of prostitution? How do we explain that they're, doing all this good? Like, what's the explanation that they have to scratch their heads and go, man, maybe there is something about their God? So how do we overcome evil with good? What advice do Peter and John have for us? I want you to unpack this. Again, this is kind of an overview of what you're going to be talking about in your growth today, but I want you to kind of put that all in your head, and as you discuss, let it be what kind of filters everything through that. Why do we do good? Why do we give blessing? Why? Not just the command, like give blessing, but no, why? What are we trying to accomplish when we give blessing? What are we trying to do when we're trying to overcome evil? And so I think you're going to have some good discussion today. Hopefully it will be hard. I think it'll be difficult, but hopefully in the end it's going to be a blessing to you, and hopefully in the end help us to overcome evil with good. So have a great discussion, and we'll see where it leads.